Okay. So, I've been asked this question a couple of times. Hey Red, I plan to put lights in my suit for whatever it is, or I want to be able to wire this speaker to the soundboard or something like that. How do I solder good? How do I solder like professional? Well, truth be told, I have been doing soldering since like my childhood, fixing up these damn things, because you know how they were back in the day, especially with the third-party stuff. Kind of crap. So, how do you do soldering? Well, with these simple tips, you should be able to solder like a pro. So what you need is a soldering iron, solder, well, the stuff you're going to melt anyway, and all your components. And if you have the money, I would suggest you get this bottle of flux.
Step 1. Plug in soldering iron. Step 2. Turn on soldering iron. If your soldering iron does not have a switch, you can negate the step. Step 3. Very important step. Wait for the soldering iron to heat up. Very important.
Alright, so there's a difference between the different wattages of soldering irons you might find on the market. You've got the 20 watt, you've got the 40 watt, and you've got the 60 watt. And sometimes you'll get the 60 watt with the adjustable like what I have. Now, there is a major difference between all those different wattages. Basically, it's how much power output you get out of it. It's like the difference between trying to cook a hamburger with a handheld lighter. Holy cow, that's a huge flame. Versus this blowtorch. Yeah, very big difference. Another trick you'll often see online when doing soldering is to take a wad of paper and just give it a good little drench of water on it. This is meant for cleaning off the tip for whenever you've got any kind of debris such as dirt or cooked flux on it. Basically keep your nozzle clean. It's like walking on charcoal. If you ever watch those guys walk on charcoal, you'll actually know that it's actually all the soot that keeps their feet from burning. Same thing happens with the tip of the soldering iron. If this thing gets covered in too much soot, that thing is not going to heat up anything.
Step 4. Put a little bit of solder onto the soldering iron tip. This creates something called a liquid bridge. Basically, imagine using a wet towel to cool down your tea. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're just going to cut off the rubber coating on this wire and... yeah, this is why you don't use scissors for trying to strip wires. You actually need to grab something called a wire stripper, which is this thing. And what this thing does is that it will actually be able to cut around the wire conductor so you can remove the jacket without actually breaking the wire. Step 5. Apply flux to whatever it is you're soldering.
So, what the flux actually does is that it cleans off the surface of whatever it is you're working on, so that when you do heat up the solder, it sticks to it. It's a condition called wetting. It's almost like if you were to take a droplet of water and just spill it on the table, how it kind of just sticks all over the table. Sometimes in solder, you'll get something called rosin core, which means that the flux is actually inside the solder. Almost as if the solder itself was a hollow tube filled with a version of this. This is not to be confused with resin, which is used for hardened fiberglass, and definitely do not confuse it with raisins. That's a big no.
After you've done this, now you can solder. After you put on the flux, you can heat it up and then put the solder onto it. Now, there's always going to be a struggle about trying to handle a 3-hand job with only 2. So I personally like to leave the soldering iron propped up so that I can maneuver my components underneath it. But sometimes I just got to switch it around. Putting solder on the component before you use it for soldering is called tinning. This allows you to easily attach stuff when you melt the two together. After you put solder on point A and point B, now you just need to put the two together, heat it back up, maybe add a little bit more solder if you really need to, but if you have it prepared well enough, you probably don't. Once they're melted together, you can remove the soldering iron and then let the solder cool. Do not move it while it's cooling, otherwise it will not stick. Now, you can solder things onto flat solder points just by going on the outside. But if you ever have to go through the in hole, all you have to do is put it in through the back and proceed with soldering. And there you go. It's pretty good. It's pretty tight.
Alright, so there are 3 main different types of solder joints that you have to keep an eye out. One is for when you're putting it on a flat, one is when you're putting it through a hole, and when you basically have to join a wire to a post. So, very simply, when you have your wire laying across the pad there, well, how you want to have the solder is to go up, over, and down very nicely. If it's going through, then you just want to be able to have just a nice little triangle going up and over it. If it's too narrow like this, you're going to have risk of breaking. If it's too narrow like that, it's going to be risk of breaking. If you have it like that, or if you have it like that, you're just spending too much solder. Or like that. This was a little bit of a funny one, because when you have the wire wrapping around here, then basically you just gotta do somewhere in between those two, where it starts to look almost like a little kind of a diamond shaped thing if you wrap the wire around it. But if you are also doing the inline, then pretty much it's just make sure that when you have it like that, just make sure there's plenty of space to go through. The solder will conduct the electricity, so don't worry too much about whether or not this stuff is going to heat up too much. It basically boils down to the thickness of your wire. If your wire is too thin to begin with, you should probably not put so much current through it, i.e. running a motor. But for something simple like LEDs or a soundboard, you can use anything up to 22 gauge. But just to put things in perspective, your house lights run off 14 gauge.
So if you ever decide to start joining wires together, what you have to do is you have to repeat the process. You gotta tin the wire by adding a little bit of flux and then touching it to hot solder in order for both sides to be tinned. And then from there, all you have to do is just melt both wires together and bam, should be good to go. Do remember that exposed wires do have a tendency to possibly touch on other things being exposed. So make sure you cover it up. It would be best if you get something called heat shrink, which is a rubber tube that tends to shrink when heated, hence the name heat shrink. But if it's in the worst case scenario, you're stuck outdoors, you should probably grab some electric tape in your toolkit.
Hey Poopball, what you doing? Well, I hope that video guys helped you out, and hopefully next time I'll see you on the next build. Riz, what are you doing? Huh? Ball? Huh? Nah.